I'm so excited to be here with you today. I've heard it's a magnificent conference. Yes? Fantastic. Well, I would like to start out our presentation on unconscious bias with a little experiment, if you would please just kind of humor me. Let me just see. I got it. Okay. So what I would like to do is kind of walk you through an exercise. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for just a moment. And what I would like you to do is imagine that you've taken a medical screening and you've been notified that the doctor wants to talk to you about your results. You call right away thinking you're going to get concerning news, but it turns out that everything seems to be okay. So you sigh a breath of relief, and you call your spouse to make plans for dinner. You go to this lovely romantic restaurant and have the most phenomenal meal. And next to you, you notice a couple celebrating their anniversary and toasting each other. The next morning, you wake up excited to go to a business conference. You arrive early to get a good seat, and you're intensely listening to a talk given by the founder and CEO of the hottest tech company startup. And you are blown away. Now that you have this solid picture in your mind, you can open your eyes. And I have some questions for you. In your mental image, was the doctor an African American? Was the married couple celebrating their anniversary two men? Did the tech CEO on stage look like me? A Latina, a woman. Now, it's okay if any of your answers are no, or if all of them are no, because you are like most people. In fact, a lot of people come and make conclusions based on what we call stereotyping. And they surface when we think of certain scenarios or roles or groups of people. So before we get into a more elaborate discussion around unconscious bias, we'd like to take a quick poll and ask you, is the following statement true or false? Bias is all about disliking certain groups. Is that true or false? Bias is about disliking certain groups. Very good. The answer is false because bias is really more about unintentionally favoring certain groups, regardless of whether they're more deserving. So how this manifests in the workplace is this is based on stereotyping about certain groups of people, and it can result in people being treated unfairly. And when that happens, companies suffer. So what is unconscious bias? And this is, a lot of people actually struggle with this idea and notion. So unconscious biases are also known as implicit biases, and they're hidden within a blind spot of the brain. And once lodged in the brain, hidden biases can influence behavior towards members of particular social groups, such as women, minorities, people of certain religions, people of certain ages, even people in your own group, and more. So unconscious bias is now widely recognized as the root cause of what becomes behaviors and actions that inhibit inclusion and belonging. And left unchecked, it damages employer reputations, it reduces talent acquisition effectiveness, and stands between a company and a significant diverse portion of the workforce. Bias also causes companies to lose diverse workers without having benefited from their full potential. And here's the thing, we all have unconscious biases. It is how our brains are wired. If you have a brain, you have unconscious biases, and they start very early. In fact, there's a famous study called the Doll Test that more demonstrates what I mean. So here, take a look.
Point to the doll that looks like you. Which one doesn't look like you?
That one.
Point to the doll that doesn't look like you.
Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted what we call a doll test. They had African American children between the ages of 3 and 7 sit in front of a table, and they had dolls to choose from. One was a black doll, one was a white doll. And they were asked to identify positive or negative characteristics associated with one or two of the dolls. And they had the option to choose.
Point to the doll that you think looks nice. Why do you think that looks nice?
Because I like his skin color.
You don't even look at the black doll. She smiles at the white doll, but she just kind of glances at the black doll.
Which one do you think sort of the ugly doll? Which doll do you think looks like the bad doll? Why do you think that one looks like the bad doll?
Because black is a bad color.
Kids are on YouTube and they're watching all these movies, and you don't think that it's going to affect, but he sees black and he's relating that to bad people.
Point to the doll that you think looks bad. Why do you think that doll looks bad?
I don't know. It just scares me. I don't know.
They're simply overexposed to positive traits with white Americans and negative traits with African Americans for a variety of reasons. And that's what's coming out in these doll studies.
Which doll do you think looks bad? Why do you think that doll looks bad?
Because it doesn't have blue eyes.
It's like all the positives were about the white doll and nothing positive about the black doll. I think just seeing your own child so clearly having a preference for her dad is darker, her sister is darker, and I think this was really hurtful. I'm sorry. I'm just, I don't know, emotional about it.
63% of African American children prefer to play with the white doll as opposed to the black doll. We find these same results today. African American children associating negative traits with African American dolls and positive traits with white dolls.
That was mean and that one's good
Why do you think that that one looks mean?
because he has black skin.
Well, I think we're gonna have to sit down and have a little talk with him. He needs to know that black isn't bad.
So many of the biases that form in our minds as children actually can last a lifetime. So you do have adults today that hold biases towards racial groups that form very early on, but are still playing out in a very real way, even though they may be 30, 40, 50 years old.
Which doll do you think looks bad? Point to the doll that you think is ugly. Which one looks like you?
I know, I've seen this video hundreds of times. My company produced this for our company, BiasInc, and I still get emotionally impacted. What you saw in this video are some important concepts. The first is it talks about, obviously, how early unconscious biases form in the brain. And when they form so early and then we grow up and we carry them into the workplace, we don't realize that they have started so early and they're so hardwired into our brain. The other thing that was brought up in this video is the fact that we often experience or demonstrate what's called in-group bias, right? So bias towards our own type, whatever that type may be. If you're a woman, it might be towards other women. If you're a person of color, it might be towards other people of color. And the key reason why this is important to understand, and it's used widely when we talk about unconscious bias, is that when these biases that form as young children are hardwired into our brains, and when we take them into the workplace, it often creates unfair outcomes for those who experience bias, no matter how it happens. So when we talk about the importance of mitigating unconscious bias, it's actually a real business issue. And I want to share some stats with you. 64% of U.S. adults have said that they have experienced bias in the workplace. Those who perceive bias are more than 3 times as likely to say they're planning to leave their current jobs within the year. At large companies, employees who perceive bias are nearly 3 times as likely to be disengaged at work. And a Gallup poll estimates active disengagement costs U.S. companies $450 billion to $550 billion per year, simply through the cost of disengagement. So when we talk about unconscious bias, a lot of companies think, oh, it's about diversity. And they look around in the room or in the cafeteria of their work environments, and they see a lot of diversity. And by the way, diversity isn't just ethnic. So it could be gender, obviously it could be ethnic, it could also be disabled, it could be other things. So they're looking at the numbers, or they're looking at how the rooms look, and they say, oh, we're diverse, therefore we're doing great. But there's actually a difference between diversity and inclusion, and this is really important for a lot of companies to address, and some companies are starting to realize the difference. So inclusion is about people's experience in the workplace. Do they feel included? So as an example, if you were to walk through your work environments, and let's just say it's the cafeteria where all the employees are people inclusive of each other, or are they sitting in their groups? Or in the workspace, are they collaborating in an inclusive way, or are they in their groups? This is a really key thing to understand, because 80% of respondents in a recent survey about their willingness to join a company indicated that inclusion is important when choosing an employer. It's no longer just about diversity. It's not so much about what they see. And in fact, 71% of respondents would prefer an organization that demonstrates inclusive behaviors but inconsistent inclusion programs. In other words, they want to see that the company is walking the walk, talking the talk. Now, they want this as opposed to high-quality inclusion program but inconsistent inclusive behaviors. Also, 23% of respondents indicated they have already left an organization for a more inclusive one, including 30% of millennial respondents. So here's the key. Diversity is not enough. It is about inclusion. It is about the experiences people have in the workplace. So I'd like to give you some mitigation tips, and then we're going to go ahead and have an opportunity to just have an open dialogue. Here's the first. Stereotyping is the foundation for unconscious bias, and that's why I opened up our session with that experiment and having you visualize the different scenarios. When you are addressing bias in the workplace, one of the things that you want to know is that you want to make sure employees understand stereotyping. And educating employees about stereotyping can raise awareness and keep people mindful of their stereotyping behaviors and perceptions. So let me give you one example of how this works. Actually, I'll give you 2 different examples. Stereotyping can apply to women in the workplace very often when a woman and a man with the same qualifications, same position, same everything, and maybe there's a plum position or plum project that would give them really great experience. The woman has young children. The man could be, or not necessarily a father. It's kind of usually irrelevant in stereotyping. The person responsible for assigning the team member to work on this plum project, which would give them experience and enhance their professional development in the corporation, might just automatically assume because the woman has children, she won't be able to put in the time and effort or the attention, or frankly, even travel for a plum assignment. So without even thinking about it, in unconscious mode, the person responsible for making the decision may just automatically assign it to the male. How does that manifest later on? The male develops more experience and creds, so when the time comes for an opportunity for promotion or advancement, guess what? He looks better. That's just one example of many. Here's another. You have your client, I know that you're client-facing, you're B2B. You may have 2 people that you want to assign for client service that goes out, the white glove treatment that goes out and actually handles the onboarding and the client care of that individual. And you may have a Caucasian individual, and you may have an African American individual. And the person making that decision may think, I think the client's going to relate better to the Caucasian individual. Unconsciously, stereotyping. So you give the opportunity to the Caucasian individual. Same type of outcome and manifestation as I gave you in the previous example with the woman. These kinds of examples happen up and down, right and left in every organization and in many different ways. Here's another mitigation tip. You want to set expectations. Let employees know that you are prioritizing bias mitigation and begin by using relevant terminology. Make sure employees understand that you value diversity. You're recruiting and bringing in lots of different people, and it's not gender, ethnicity. I mentioned disabled. Some companies are now looking at veterans. There's all kinds of definitions around gender now. And then you also want to talk about inclusion, which I just explained, and then equity. And when we talk about equity, what we're really talking about are the financial outcomes of someone in the workplace. And you're hearing a lot more about that in recent years with the fallout of the Me Too movement and women and pay disparity, which is a real problem in many, many organizations. You also want to include a diversity statement in your organizational values demonstrating your commitment to diversity. And you don't want to just talk about we're a diverse company. You want to give examples of how you're being inclusive and how you value equity. You also want to promote dialogue. You want to create a culture that promotes open expression and discussion about bias that not only educates and builds trust among employees, but also reinforces the organization's values. You want to make leaders responsible for the outcomes and experiences of people in the organization. You want to ensure decision makers are accountable for the organization's values, which will demonstrate the importance of an unbiased workplace to the organization's culture. I also want to digress here for just a moment and talk to you about languaging that often happens with respect to leaders. So very often, if an employee decides to bring up an experience that they have witnessed or they themselves have experienced to their manager or their executive that they report to, and if that manager or executive listens to it and then says, "You're too sensitive," "Oh, I didn't mean it that way," or he didn't mean it that way, "It's not that big of a deal, get over it," and everything in between. Those are many instances in which a person's experience is being devalued in an organization. And leaders really need to know and understand that, even if in fact they're thinking maybe he or she is being too sensitive to this matter. So languaging and how you respond is extremely important. That's some of the work that we do at my company at BiasInc. And it is directly correlated, by the way, with people's perception about empathy in an organization. And if they feel heard and valued, the empathy scores go up. if they don't feel heard and valued, and this is often a way it appears in that they are not valued, the empathy score goes down, and there's a very direct correlation between cognitive empathy in a workplace and how high or how low it is, and turnover. Very direct correlation. Low scores on empathy, high turnover. Difficulty with retention. You also want to provide unconscious bias training. So training can benefit the entire workforce by educating employees and reassuring those who may feel excluded that bias is being actively discussed and addressed. And it's not just enough, by the way, to provide these one-off trainings. At my company at BiasInc, as an example, we train through an online module. We also provide assessments to give individuals their levels of unconscious bias so they have understanding about themselves. The organization leaders get a dashboard that tells them the levels of unconscious bias in the organization. But beyond that, then there's this ongoing mitigation strategy. Monthly, what we call snackables, and it's priming habits, because that's what's really important. It's not just because a lot of companies think, oh, we'll just bring in or we'll just have a round of unconscious bias training and that we've got it covered. But it's not enough to expect people simply because they want to do better will do better. We know through the science of psychology and organizational behavior that what you need to do is implement policies, practices, and prime the muscle, so to speak, on how to be a more inclusive organization and focused on mitigating unconscious bias. So here are the takeaways. You want to make sure employees understand stereotyping. You also want to set expectations. That's a lot. I could spend 2 hours just on that. You want to promote dialogue. You want to make it okay and safe for people to bring up instances and where they have felt either slighted, experienced what we call microaggressions or micro insults. That example I gave you, where if someone goes to a manager and talks about an experience and they're kind of diminished, and that's a microaggression or a micro insult. Those add up. Even though they're little things, they add up. You also want to make leaders responsible, and there's a lot of work that can be done there, and you want to provide bias training. So at this point, I really would like to just open it up and answer any questions that come up and have just an open dialogue. You cannot get rid of unconscious bias. It's very hard to get rid of our biases. It takes intensive work. And frankly, no organization should be focused on getting rid of people's unconscious biases. Where the real work happens is how do you mitigate it? So it starts with education. We all have unconscious biases. You saw how small these children were, and already we're expressing preferences, right? The second thing is with awareness and education, then it's, okay, now let's all come together and mitigate the impact of unconscious bias so that at the end of the day, what we're really striving for is a more fair and respectful workplace where everyone feels valued. So I think your question about, so how do you make it comfortable? I think it starts first with the organization leaders, starting at the very, very top, that CEO and the C-suite, talking about the importance of mitigating the impact of unconscious bias in the workplace. So, and there's many ways, obviously, that organization leaders, communicate that. And then there's building in practices and into the organization. So there might be things, for example, amongst the leaders where you have quarterly meetings where you're focused on, okay, what's happening in the organization, what do we need to do, and there's all kinds of practices around that. And it's around, if you really look at it, unconscious bias impacts sales, it impacts customer service. I was just at PG&E last week, and they told me they see unconscious bias directly correlated to safety hazards. Safety hazards in a utility company. Right? Safety hazards. So it affects recruitment, it affects retention, it really impacts every division in a company. So I think beyond that, it's bringing the organization leaders and having practices and experts who can help look at the practices within the organization. And then when you start promoting the ability, even just using the terminology, we're going to focus on, we want to make sure everyone feels like they're treated fair and respectfully. That then starts to make it a little bit more comfortable for people to talk about it. But also tools need to be given to everybody. on communication tools. So it's not just the individuals having tools to be able to express their experiences and feel like it's okay. By the way, part of the work that our experts do around this is also letting people know that if someone inadvertently, because we're assuming everybody's a good person. You know, the people on the fringe are on the fringe, but the majority of people in an organization are good people, and everyone wants to do a good job. And you know what? We're all going to mess up. We're going to miss the mark on occasion. And so part of the work that our experts do with employees to help them talk about it is also to say, hey, listen, if someone expressed unbiased towards you, don't just automatically assume that that person is an a-hole, okay? But give the person a benefit of the doubt, but open up the lines of communication, right? And so, there's work that should be done with respect to communication strategies and tools for those who want to express their experiences, and then there's communication tools and strategies for those in leadership positions who would be the ones who would be dealing or addressing or managing these kinds of issues.
Well, I love you said it's a monthly thing that you do.
Yeah, the monthly
It's like
habits.
top of mind.
Yes.
Keep it alive.
Right. That's why New Year's resolutions often don't work. Because you start off the new year, you make your resolution, you're gung-ho, you're excited, but just wanting to do it isn't enough. You got to actually do something, right? And so that's why the monthly habits, we call habits of heroes, snackables, yeah, they're really important in that process. We develop biases often first of all, when we start as children because of what we're exposed to, right? So imagery in television, and I don't even say television anymore, YouTube and devices, so programming that we're consuming. We also, by the way, absorb it from our parents and our family members, and then when we get to school age, we absorb it in classrooms. And by the way, there's a whole other area of unconscious bias in education, K through 12, and then the issues in higher education. So based on exposure, right, and all these images you've grown up seeing and exposed to every day, multiple times a day, when I gave you that scenario, you're in default mode without thinking about it, you actually went to that, right? And that's what happens. So when we call this in-group bias, right, so there are a lot of studies that show that women show stronger levels of bias towards other women than men. Many women are surprised to hear that. We, generally speaking, are more biased towards other women, right? And a lot of us think, oh my gosh, I'm such an advocate for women, I want to help women succeed, I want to help, and it might be the woman who's making that decision. Remember I mentioned to you the mom and the young children and et cetera. And so we can't help it. That's just how our brains are wired, based on stereotyping that goes back to based on exposure and what we're exposed to. So now that you've had this experience, I'm sure that this will come up for you in the future as you think about different scenarios. So it's normal, it happens, we're all good people. Now that we're aware of it, what do we do about it when it matters? Oh, I'm sorry. Also, I wanted to say, Jason, your point about not all bias is bad, you're absolutely right. Bias, if you look at the whole scientific side of it and level 1 thinking and level 2 thinking, and there's a lot of work in that space, stereotyping allows us to come to very quick decisions, and it really matters in cases of safety or those kinds of things, right? So you might be walking down in the evening a dark alley, and immediately your brain is processing all this bits of information, and you are coming to quick decisions, and they're designed to protect you. That's another form of stereotyping. But it's a good situation in that case. And you talked about the preference for Volvos, right? Okay, for a certain reason. So not all biases are bad. It's just when they manifest where you're giving preferences to certain groups of people for no other reason than you just are giving preferences because of unconscious bias. Yeah, so decision-making is a really key area to focus on when you're talking about mitigating unconscious bias in the workplace. And often it depends on what the impact of the decisions that are being made. So at a baseline, there should be education around how to mitigate or eliminate bias as it seeps into decision-making. So the answer is all of the above. Sometimes it is important to have a group involved in the decision making, and sometimes it's okay for one individual to be making the decision as long as there's education awareness around how bias can steep into that process. So we see this a lot, with recruitment and now going to committees in the process hiring. But by the way, very interesting, the studies that are showing even the efforts to bring more diverse candidates into the pool of people that are being considered doesn't necessarily translate into more diverse candidates being hired. Why? Because there is a role that is subjective in that process. They can be recruited in, you could have a mandated, make sure there's a woman in every pool of candidates, make sure there's a blah, blah, blah in every pool of candidates, and then when the time comes and people are making assessments about them, bias can seep in. Well, I think that person's probably has more experience. By the way, this comes up with people of color a lot, and I'll give you something to think about. We, I'm sure, are familiar with the idea of, in some instances, giving greater weight to an individual who graduated from an Ivy League school, okay? The truth is, there are a lot of capable people, in particular people of color, who were just as capable but didn't have the opportunity or chance to go to an Ivy League school. But when they show up and it's time to make a decision about who's being hired, right, weight is given, often, in some instances, to the Ivy League education. We also have studies that show that if you have a Caucasian and an African American who both went to Harvard, the African American's degree from Harvard is going to be diminished because there's going to be a perception he or she got there based on a quota. I mean, it shows up in so many ways, right? So decision making is really important. A lot of work, with the right kinds of experts can come into an organization and look at those processes and make recommendations. Does that help you? Sure. Some of the mitigation strategy and work that happens is actually expanding your network of people. So, and that just doesn't mean other groups, other ethnic groups or racial groups. It may mean if you're just hanging out with the IT people because that's your group, you should go spend time with the salespeople, right? Or customer service people. It's a lot of it is about exposure, because the more we get exposed to other groups of people, including people who are disabled and others, the more we can relate to them. Because often bias is about who's like me. So if I don't have a good understanding of individuals who are different than me, then they're not like me, and so therefore bias seeps in. So one of the ways that's recommended in an organization as part of the ongoing strategies is to implement monthly habits to expose your exposure to network of people. Oh, very, very good question. And not an easy one, because some of it's dependent on the culture and the organization that you work for. So many of us, I'm sure, have seen or stood by as someone has experienced a microaggression or micro-insult. And these are like tiny little things. They're small in terms of they can happen in a moment, but when they add up, they're actually pretty significant. One of my engineers in my company, she's actually employee number one, right, in a tech company. Always have employees, they're numbered. They like to know their numbers. She's a Latina. She's the first in her family to graduate from college, and she actually graduated from Harvard University. And she told me about her experience in a previous company where she was in a room and she was asked to go get the drinks for everybody when there was an admin in the room. So she brought it up, and of course, from her perspective, it was because she was the woman in the room, right? In a situation like that, by the way, she didn't have someone who spoke up for her. She actually has the gumption, she's pretty strong, and she raised it herself. which is good. But not everyone feels comfortable doing that. So I think if you are in an environment that values open dialogue, I think it can be easier to go to the person who inadvertently expressed the bias, action or behavior or words and say, hey, I'm not sure if you realize it, but that person may have felt this or that, or whatever the case is. You may want to go up to the person who you think experienced it and say, I noticed that, and I'm just wondering if it were me, I might have felt uncomfortable. Did you feel uncomfortable? In other words, relate to them. And then talk about whether or not something can be said. If you're in a less open environment, I still think it's valuable to be able to, approach the person who you witnessed experience the situation and talk to them about it and get their feelings. Now, from their perspective, it may have just been nothing, okay, good. But if it was, at least having someone commiserate can make a difference. So I think it's really based on the culture and how you feel the organization is. But I think the ability to step up for someone is really important. And the more we are able to, and by the way, if you're in an environment that isn't very open about that, maybe bringing it up actually can start the conversations around being a more inclusive environment.